Alright then gang, so now we have identity installed on our project locally, but also enabled on Netlify for the project as well. The next step is to communicate between our project and Netlify using the Netlify identity package that we did install. Now, what we want to do is we want to be able to track the auth state and the current user throughout the whole application. So what we're going to do is use React context to provide some global app auth state. So the first thing I'm going to do is come over to our project and create a new folder, and I'm going to call this stores like so. So whenever I create context, I generally put them inside a stores folder, and then I'm going to create a new file and we'll call this auth context.js. So this is going to be the file that basically keeps track of the authentication state of the current user on the website. So the first thing we're going to do inside here is import something from React, and that something is a function called create context. This is what allows us to create a context object, and that's going to come from React. So we can say const, give this a name. I'm going to call it auth context like so, and set that equal to create context and then invoke it. So this is how we create a context in React. And again, we're just creating context as a way to provide global state to the entire application, and that global context or global state is going to be the user, whether they're logged in, if they're not logged in, if they are, then who is the user, etc. Okay? Now, this context is going to come with some default values, and we can specify those default values inside an object as an argument inside this function. So the values I want to give this is, first of all, a user value. So this is going to be the actual user logged in. If there's no user, it's going to be null. And the default value for this particular property is going to be null. Okay. The second one is going to be a login function. So I'm going to set that equal to a function, an arrow function like so. Now we're not going to flesh this out right here because these are just blank default values for the context, and we're going to update these values later on and pass those into our application. But for now, we're just kind of creating almost like a canvas of what this context is going to look like. So the next function is going to be a logout function inside this, and that's going to be just an empty function again. And then finally, we're going to have an auth ready state. And that auth ready state is basically going to keep track of when we've established a connection to Netlify identity, because when we load up our application in a browser, it might take a fraction of a second to identify whether a user is logged in or is not logged in while it communicates with Netlify. So until it does establish that connection and figures that out, this is going to be false, but later on it's going to be true. All right, so this is our kind of default context object, and these are the different values and functions that we're going to pass into our application. So we can use these things anywhere. We could access the user anywhere, or we could log in a user or log out a user from anywhere in the application. All right. Now, when we use a context, we also need a provider, and the provider is the thing that actually provides the context to the application, the other components. So what I'm going to do is create a new component right here, and I'm going to export this. So export const, and then it's going to be auth context provider like so. We set that equal to a function. Now this is just a React component, so we need to return some kind of template, right? Now the thing that we return is going to be this auth context, which is actually a component. This returns a component, so we say auth context like so, but then dot, and we say provider like this. All right, so this thing right here has a provider attached to it, and that's what we're outputting. This component right here is essentially just wrapping this component, and the reason we're doing this is so we can add in a load of other logic in this component to log users in, log them out, update this value and this value, etc. And then eventually we're just going to return the provider and pass through those different values that we are going to change inside this component. I hope that makes sense. So this thing right here, this auth context provider, is essentially going to have to wrap our entire application. So this wraps our entire application because it needs to wrap the components that it wants to provide the data to. So let's open up now our pages and then go into app. So this is the root of the application. It's where the navbar is registered and where the pages are output. And what I want to do is wrap these things with our context provider. So this thing right here. So I'm going to change this div right here to be the auth context provider. I can click on this to import it. It's going to auto import it there for me. And then we need to change the bottom as well. Auth context provider, like so. So it's wrapping these components, and this is where the pages are output. So that could be the guides or the index. And therefore, these other components now are going to get access to any value that we pass inside this thing right here. But before we do that, we have to take in these things as the children. Now, the way this works is we destructure the children from the props. Now, this children right here basically represents whatever this component wraps over here. So it wraps these two things, right? And then those two things are basically the children. So we want to output the children inside this thing over here, like this. So what we're basically saying is, okay, when we use this component, take these things and place them right here. So essentially, we're just wrapping this around the children instead of this. But by wrapping this, instead, again, we can use all of the logic in here to change the value and pass that dynamic value in here. So we need to pass in the value prop, and this is where we pass in the context values to the rest of the components. So this could be any old value. I could pass in hello, for example. And what that does is create kind of like this global value called hello, and it passes it to the components that it wraps. So these things right here. So I could access this value from any of those other components. For example, the navbar, and I'll show you how we do that. If I go to navbar, if I want to use that context, I can say const, and then I'll call this val, it doesn't really matter what it's called, and set it equal to use context. So this thing right here, and it's imported it for me right here. So this is a hook that we use to use a particular context. Now we need to say what context we want to use. Well, we want to use the auth context, right? So I'm going to say auth context like so, and we do need to import that as well. So I'm going to import auth context, and that is going to be from, and we need to come out of the current directory, then into stores, and then we want the auth context file. So we're importing auth context from here. Now, in order to do that, we have to actually export the auth context because we're not doing that at the minute. So let me say export default auth context. Oops, capital auth context, like so. So if I save that now, we're importing it over here and we're using it right here. So this value will be whatever value we pass into the provider right here. So if I was to log this to the console.log the val, like so, come over here and I'm going to open up the console. We get an error at the minute. Let me have a look at that. So let me just refresh and we can see hello logged to the console. Awesome. So that works. Now, obviously, we want this value to be dynamic, and not just dynamic, but a bunch of values. We want it to be these different values right here that might change over time. Now, we don't have all of those values and all of those different bits of functionality yet. So instead, let's just start by passing a user value inside this prop. So to do that, I'm going to create some state. So we'll keep track of the current user as they log in and out of the application. And to do that, we'll be using the use state hook. So set user. And if you don't understand any of this, again, check out my React series. The link to that is going to be down below. All right, so we set that equal to use state, like so. I'm going to press on this one to auto import it. And we want to set an initial value for this user. So null, because when the application first loads, we're just going to assume the user is not logged in to begin with, right? But then what we're going to do is track that value over time. So if they log in, we'll update this user state. So what I'm going to do now is pass in the user value instead. And now I can go back to this navbar component and I'm going to change this to user because that would be the value I get back now. And save it. And by the way, it doesn't have to be called the same thing as this over here. You can call it XYZ if you prefer. It's just so I know what it is inside this component. If I go over here, we can see now null is logged to the console. So it's still grabbing that context value. All right, so we have this value passed through in the provider, and over time it will change. And as it does change, that change will be reflected over here. Now, there's one more thing I want to do in this lesson, and that's just to initialize the connection to Netlify identity on Netlify. Because at the minute, we're not really doing that. We're not doing anything with that local package we installed, Netlify identity, and we're not connecting to the backend. So I'm going to do this inside a use effect hook. So use effect is going to fire a function when the component first mounts, and as a second argument, we'll do an empty dependency array. So it only fires once when the component first mounts. And then inside here, I'll do a little comment to say init Netlify identity connection. And all we have to do is use that package that we installed. Now we need to import it first of all. So I'm going to say import Netlify identity, if I can spell it like so, from, and it's Netlify-identity-widget. All right, so we've imported that. We can now just copy that, and down here we can paste it and then say dot init. So this is going to initialize that service. It's going to make a connection to Netlify for us, and Netlify can then kind of determine whether a user is logged in or out of our website. So that's all we need to do for now, but let me just run you through this one more time because I know we've covered quite a lot here. First of all, we've created a context with some default state or default values inside that context, which is an object with these different properties. Now, again, they're just default values, so they don't really mean much on their own. It's kind of like a blueprint of how our context is going to look. And basically, we're not passing any of that through as a value inside the context provider right here. But later on, we will do, and those values are going to change. These ones are going to change, but these ones won't change. Anyway, once we have that, we create this component to wrap the provider, and the reason we wrap it is so we can do all this kind of logic right here, so that we can keep track of the different values and pass those values in to the auth context provider. And this thing is wrapping this children thing right here, and that children is this stuff right here. So the auth context provider is wrapping our page components and the navbar, and that means that those components have access to this value we pass through. So to access that, we just say use context, we pass in the auth context because that's the one we want the value from, and we get it back. And as the value changes over time right here, which it will do, then that's going to be updated anywhere we use that context. I hope that makes sense. For now, what I'm going to do is just refresh over here. I get an error at the minute, but don't worry too much about that at the minute. You probably won't get that error, but if you do not worry, it's not going to be there later on. But that's everything set up now. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how we can use Netlify identity to sign up and log in.